Welcome, everyone, to Misguided the Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today I'm speaking with psychologist Sander van der Linden. Sander is one of the leading researchers studying misinformation, propaganda, and how people can build resistance to manipulation. If you heard of the idea pre-bunking or psychological inoculation, which is training people to recognize misinformation before they encounter it, Sander is one of the key scholars behind that work. I've certainly cited his research many times myself. In this conversation, we talk about his non-traditional path into psychology, from leaving a 9-to-5 banking job to discovering research as a career, and how early experiences being misled himself sparked a deeper interest in influence and propaganda. We then dig into what psychological inoculation actually is, why simply giving people facts often isn't enough, and how tools like the bad news game help people recognize manipulation techniques across political and cultural contexts. We also zoom out to the bigger picture, the economics of manipulation, how cheap it is to create inauthentic accounts, and what that means for our information ecosystem, especially in the age of AI. Finally, we talk about solutions from education and platform responsibility to why Sander remains cautiously optimistic despite some very real challenges. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share it with a friend, subscribe, and leave a rating. It really helps more people discover the show. All right, let's get into it. Sander, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I've been reading your work for a long time, and it's really cool to actually speak with you in this format and hear more about what you're working on now and some of the work that you've been doing. But before we jump into your research and your academic work, I was curious if you could share with my listeners your journey into becoming a psychologist and studying these different topics. So if you could just share what that was like deciding to pursue graduate school, for example. What made you pursue psychology in the first place?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to be able to chat. I guess, I have a pretty non-traditional journey. I think some of my students know about that, but not everyone. I mean, I never planned on going to graduate school. After I graduated from my bachelor's degree, my parents thought it would be prudent for me to find a job and make some money. And so that's what I did initially, and I got a job, office job, 9 to 5. Really didn't like that. I had some issues with authority and also coming and leaving at certain times of the day. And so I just found out that there's such a thing as graduate school and that you can get master's degrees. I decided to quit my job, and then I actually got a tax refund from having worked full time for the first time. They actually taxed me way too much by accident. My parents were like, "Yeah, fine." They've been always very supportive, but they were like, if you want to do more, if you want to study more, you gotta, finance that yourself. And so I didn't really have any money to pay for graduate school. This was for a master's degree initially. So I used the tax refund actually to do a master's degree, and that degree was in. It was called human development, but it was sort of psychology and policy. And I became really intrigued by the nexus between the two. So I know I wanted to learn more about social issues and societal issues and, things. I was working after I graduated. I was working at a bank. So, I was making rich people more money. And I decided that was not my life's purpose. And so I thought, how could I, contribute to interesting things in society? And so then I discovered that, you can study questions about human behavior that are not completely abstract, but also relate to big policy issues, vaccination, climate change, all of these sort of big picture questions. And I thought that was fascinating. So initially what I studied was how people make trade-offs between what's good for themselves versus what's good for other people. And you and I probably know that as a social dilemma for people who are listening. And I found that fascinating. And so I did a bunch of experiments for my master's degree at the time. And I just fell in love with this idea of doing research. And still, when doing the master's, it still wasn't apparent to me that you could then do a PhD and then people actually make a living doing research. And so one of the things the only thing I liked about the finance job was the modeling and the quantitative aspects, because I was always good at that at undergrad and loved stats. And so what I took from that was that I was interested in modeling things and also I loved running experiments on people. I just thought that was fascinating, having browsed all sorts of different academic subjects and took a lot of different classes. What I find most interesting is just direct empirical observation of, how can you observe change, human behavior. And so, so then once I realized, hey, people can do this for a living, can do research for a living and get paid for it, and you can make your own hours and set your own research agenda, and the flexibility. I didn't realize that suited my lifestyle and my interests just to such a close degree. Also, my temperament. I mean, not that having a job. I mean, some people love structure, right? And they need
Mhm.
structure to thrive, and they want colleagues and daily interaction. I was just not that person. I was a bit aloof, spacing out, zoning out. I need my own time. I like to think about problems, and so the confused professor job seemed to be really up my specialty. So I applied for PhD programs, and then initially I studied influence. So the field of research in social psychology is called influence. And so I was interested in how people are influenced. And I've always been interested in psychology in the sense that this is not a major academic explanation. But during my undergrad, there was this guy who used to just tell me complete bullshit. So I would come to school and he'd be like, "Yo, did you read that news headline?" And he would just tell me complete nonsense. And I would just eat it up and I'd be like, "Yo, oh, I didn't know that. That sounds crazy." And then, later on, when I'd already spread this story to lots of different people, he would tell me like, "Dude, I can't believe you fell for that. That was, totally nonsense. You're so easily manipulated." And that really got me thinking about why people accept information from other people. It wasn't just once that he did that. He did that like, multiple times, and I fell for it. And even when I thought I was gonna get him, he find new ways to trick me. And then I started doing that to other people, and I realized that actually it's really easy and it's kind of funny. And the context would be like when you show up for an exam and they would tell you, oh, it's been canceled. And then, people would go home. I mean, at least I would then run after people and say, it's just a joke, but I'm not sure if he had that kind of ethical debriefing after the experiment. So on an interpersonal level, I was just fascinated. How are people influenced by information? Where is manipulation? And then on a more personal level, this wasn't a direct academic sort of inspiration, but my background, my family is Jewish, and so most of my family was executed during World War II, and that's something that when you grow up and your parents sort of tell you about that, it doesn't really land that much when you're younger in terms of what that actually means. But as I grew older, I became intrigued by propaganda and how propaganda influences people to do, how do otherwise good people end up doing bad things. And the Holocaust has been widely studied as an example of that. And, lots of people in social psychology have a similar story. Following World War II, lots of psychologists became interested in, why do people do bad things. But it was of interest to me as well. It wasn't something that then directly led me to study anti-Semitism or something. I mean, that's something I've actually gotten into the last few years for, many, many, many years. Not something I directly researched, but it gave me the interest in propaganda and disinformation and the power of that from an early age. Now thinking about things like the Bondi shooting, for example, how in the context of intergroup conflict, propaganda influences people is very much something I'm interested in. So yeah, that's kind of the long story.
It's both interesting to me, but I think it's useful too, because sometimes when I talk to students, they don't know that a lot of times we take winding paths to, professor land or research paradigms.
Yeah.
It's not something that we immediately feel like we have it all figured out in a plan. It's interesting to hear your origin story with with your friend sharing misinformation with you, and then develop the whole research paradigm to get him back.
Yeah, yeah, that was that guy. I've never, after we graduated, I never saw him again. Maybe once, but he was sneaky. But I really enjoyed this guy because he was just sarcasm all day long.
Mhm.
Maybe it was like a deflection mechanism of his own insecurities about things, but yeah, he was good fun. Yeah, and then people don't. I mean, they think like, Cambridge or Princeton or whatever places you go, it sounds, like you've always been a serious, studious person. And I was always interested in studying, and I felt like that was something I was good at, rather than I wasn't very good at building things, for example. I'm still absolutely terrible at building things, but I do try. But no, I mean, I went to California State University, Chico. I don't know, like lots of people have never heard of that school, and people who have probably know that the main reason why that historically as a well-known school is because it was a big party school in the 90s. And, it was a fun school to be at. But actually, that's why I developed my interest in psychology. There was a class, took a psychology class, with some of Bob Cialdini's seminal work on social influence. And different from the Netherlands, where I started in my initial studies, where, you get a textbook and then you have a 3-hour exam at the end of term, and that's it. They don't do quizzes, nothing interactive. It's very old school, sort of. But the class in California, the exercise was go into a store and observe people and like write it down and like see what influences people when they buy things. And then you had the book, the principles of influence, and then you had to sort of cross check. And it was very interactive. It was like a field experiment. And I thought, oh, this is like the coolest thing ever. Figure out what motivates people, what drives people. And that really initially got me interested in social psychology. And I tell Bob Cialdini this, I told him several times so reading his book really inspired me to get into psychology.
It's a great book, and it's amazing how those experiences in our psychology classes can impact us, years later, just, doing something more interactive. I was also lucky that my professors as an undergrad had me do some of that stuff in psychology and sociology courses. I also went to a school that's not widely recognized, Westminster College, a tiny liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. But I loved going there because my professors were so great and so committed to teaching and learning. And I was able to just actually speak there recently as part of my book tour. And that was super cool too, to see some of my old professors, talk with them and meet the new students and see what they're up to. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of really great opportunities at the collegiate level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think no matter where you go, I mean, there's a lot of really great professors that are really committed to teaching at a lot of these different institutions that can have huge impacts on their students.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because now all we care about is research, but looking back, I think what you say is actually pretty important. Like a lot of them really do care about teaching and about students and inspiring them, and certainly that was the case for me. If it had been a boring class and the teachers didn't care, who knows? I might have not pursued it. So it does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving into some of the research,
Mm,
I was curious if you could share, basically start at a high level about what even is psychological inoculation, and
yeah.
if you could share some of your ideas on how that field has evolved over the years, and then also like what are some practical everyday steps that people can take away from it from in their lives.
Yeah. So inoculation theory, I mean, the way that I usually explain it is through the biomedical analogy, right? That we're so used to thinking about giving people facts and evidence, and sometimes surprised that doesn't work. You've written a lot of good stuff on, the role of identity, that sometimes leads people to prefer, other motives over accuracy. But certainly inoculation is premised on the idea that instead of giving people facts, you actually give them a weakened dose of the misinformation or the techniques used to produce misinformation, and then you refute and deconstruct those in advance, which is a little bit different from standard media literacy or fact checking, in that you actually administer a weakened dose of the manipulative material, and then you refute it and deconstruct it, just as the body receives a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection. Turns out it works the same with the brain, and that we need examples, weakened dose examples of what deception looks like, and then we need to train the brain how to recognize them and how to discern between nefarious invaders and healthy cells, so to speak, just as what a vaccine does. And the more examples we're exposed to in controlled weakened form, the better we get at identifying and neutralizing them. And those antibodies, the cognitive antibodies, can be measured in lots of interesting ways. How motivated people are, their memory of the inoculation, how good they are at discerning between manipulation, non-manipulation. People now doing physiological stuff about, are people experiencing a level of threat in response to misinformation, and is that what's driving the rest of the responses in terms of motivation versus cognitive. But another term that we've used to describe it that doesn't use the medical analogy, because some people are a little bit uncomfortable with the medical analogy, So if you think about debunking as, trying to correct things after the fact, then the opposite of debunking is pre-bunking. And that's what inoculation is for us. I should say now, looking at the evolution over time, pre-bunking has become a bigger thing, is that you can pre-bunk misinformation in lots of interesting ways, one of which is through inoculation theory. I think that's the best way to look at it, and that's one of the major ways in which pre-bunking is implemented. But, other people have tried things like counterfactual thinking and, other ways of doing pre-bunking. And it all traces back to Bill McGuire, who was a prominent social psychologist and came up with the initial analogy of inoculation. And to be fair, before that, there was Aristotle, who thought about preempting the deception techniques that snake oil salesmen used in ancient Greece. He was, now we have wellness grifters. Back in the day, they had grifters too. And Aristotle was concerned about helping people identify them. So I think it has a long epistemic sort of tradition of trying to preempt exploitation and manipulation. And McGuire was just the one who wrapped it in the vaccine analogy so it could be operationalized and tested and experimented on in a way that allows for causality and figuring out the exact details. McGuire, he did some contrived sort of experiments in a very theoretical setting as a proof of concept, but then he kind of left it at that, and he didn't actually test it in the context of propaganda or misinformation. And so that's kind of where we picked up in terms of where he left off. And I guess for me, the takeaway, so McGuire has this interesting story that I think is worth sharing. He was motivated during the Korean War, which is sometimes called the Forgotten War because the Vietnam War received much more attention. But the Korean War, during that time, there were about 18 or 19. Well, there was one UK national, I think. There were mostly United States military who were captured by enemy troops, and they were quote unquote brainwashed. I mean, that was the story, that they after the war they decided to not participate in expatriation in being expatriated back to their home country. They stayed behind in communist China voluntarily, and so the U.S. government thought they had been brainwashed by enemy troops, and they were motivated on how to prevent that from happening. And they thought they need a pamphlet with facts. The military needs more pamphlets with facts about why America is so great. Why would you ever leave capitalism? Because, this was about capitalism versus communism at the time. And so McGuire, though, had this insight that, and regardless of all the specifics about inoculation theory and the analogy and all of that, I think for me, the crux is this particular insight, is that what he said basically was that what the soldiers needed was a weakened dose simulation of what it's like to be brainwashed by enemy troops in order to build mental immunity against it. And so that, for me, was the core idea. He never did actually tested that, but that was the logic behind inoculation, that they don't need a fact sheet. They need a weakened dose simulation of what it's like to be exposed to brainwashing techniques. And from that, I took this idea of the simulation, because what better way is there to administer the weakened dose, I thought, than to put people into a simulator? And of course, McGuire didn't have those tools at his disposal at the time in the 60s, but now, we have social media simulators. So we built one, and that later became a game called Bad News, where we could put players into a simulator, expose them to weakened doses of the techniques that are used to manipulate people online, and let people figure out for themselves, build up their own antibodies in figuring out how to deconstruct them and how to resist them, and get a behind the scenes look at how bad actors might try to exploit people. And that kind of became the Bad News Project. And then we did some other games, and then we made animated videos, and then we did quizzes and infographics, and we're now thinking virtual reality. And so there's lots of ways in which you can do the simulation essentially. But for me, that's the important part, not so much the specific text or the specific, order of things. I think that the power of this approach is you take a weakened simulation of a future attack, you administer it on people, you help them identify and neutralize it, and that's how people build resistance.
It's a fascinating approach, and something that I was working at Notre Dame, and it's great because these games and these techniques are tested throughout series of studies. Like there's a whole evidence collective of how they work in different settings, and people have tried different approaches, and it's one of the strongest evidence-based counters to misinformation that I've seen. And it's so scalable as far as the online component. But I was kind of curious if you could talk more about getting the scalability as far as getting more people to play it. Like when the people who do play it, we see that it works pretty well. But then how do we get people who are maybe are not interested in improving their media literacy? Does that fall more on, friends and family to reach out to them? Or do you have different ideas on how we can get more
Yeah.
pre-bunking to more people?
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is also some of the things about the book. When I wrote the book, Foolproof, it was partly a story about the research and partly to help everyday people. But in retrospect, I think I could have probably said more about how people could use it in their own daily lives. I do have a chapter on that, but it could be more concrete. I think I always have this hesitation to be too prescriptive because when you apply this, because as you know, what we test works on average, and so when you tell people to use this on a particular individual without knowing anything about the individual, it gets a bit trickier. But I give some broad descriptions of how to make it useful. So just to back up a little bit, yeah, I think that's absolutely right with the games. And so, one goal was you can get people in the lab, you can give them a pre-bunk of a specific myth, and then they become more resistant when you have them Google it on the computer. But then, you can't pre-bunk every myth. So then we started doing techniques, which is also, much more non-political in the current environment, that we inoculate people against the building blocks of conspiratorial thinking or polarization or emotional manipulation or ad hominem attacks or scapegoating. And that can come from any source. It can come from any side. And if you empower people to recognize those techniques, that can only be beneficial in the sense that no matter who uses them, people will be able to recognize it, right? And so that I feel was part of the scalability story. And then we tried to use different vehicles to deliver it. But one of the issues with the game is that people have to come to the game, right? They have to opt in. And so we know it works for those people who opt in. And we see that in our social media campaigns too. I mean, we try to do lots of different field experiments these days to get more into behavior. In a recent paper, so we have two new papers actually coming out. So in one paper, we just did a campaign on X, and then we scraped what people post. And there's so much noise. In the end, they could only guarantee that about 7.5% of people saw our actual pre-bunk on the platform. I mean, that's tiny percentage. So we
Right.
couldn't actually find an effect. I mean, in another experiment, we show that on Instagram, where we scale it and we ensure that people see the pre-bunk. There we see big effects, very consistent effects. They last over time in a real social media setting. But that's because we make sure people see and engage with the content, right? And so I think the challenge is operational. Like how can you get people to actually engage with the content? There's a few different ways of doing that. So when we worked with, Evil Corp, quote unquote. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, we had a big collaboration with Google, and they were great when they were interested. And the research teams are really interested, but their hands are tied at the moment. They're told they can't do anything or they'll lose all funding. The research arms are the first ones to get cut at these companies when there's political headwind. But they own YouTube, right? So those annoying ads that you can't skip on YouTube? They would put them in the ad space. That's where the pre-bunk would go, and then people can't skip them, and then you can reach billions of people all at once, right? So there are ways of scaling this, but those ways require external collaborations, right? With, let's say, technology companies who need to implement it. Another way that we found was working with public health authorities like the WHO, who could target people on social media that they think might benefit from the game or the video. But at the end of the day, people often ask, why do you work with governments? Why do you work with technology companies? Because they could, in some scenario, misuse the approach or stop using it. And it's true. I mean, you're basically dependent on whether they're willing to do the right thing for their users and for the population, right? So at the end of the day, though, inoculation is a tool that was, I think, in my understanding of it, was by the people for the people. It's not. There's no Uber inoculator who's going to come and inoculate people. I mean, anyone can use this tool. One powerful anecdote is the company that created the videos for us. They got so into these techniques that they say they now sit in the office here in the UK and they listen to politicians on the radio and they make it a game calling out the manipulation techniques for which they created these videos. They're like, scapegoating that. That's false dilemma, right? And so One of the findings from inoculation theory is that unlike the biological vaccine, which you can't take out of your body and give it to somebody else, with the social variant, you can actually inoculate other people vicariously. And that's, I think, is a really powerful theoretical and practical implication of inoculation theory, that you can actually pass it on to other people. And when you do, you also strengthen the inoculation within yourself because you're practicing and rehearsing it. And so it becomes stronger. Um, and I think that aspect is really interesting. And there's some research on that too, that you could pass. It gets diluted over time because people kind of forget things and the next person forgets things. And if you look at the chain, right, it gets watered down, but people can inoculate other people. And if you ask me like how to do this in person, like people listen, like, hey, what's the point of this? Who do I pre-bunk somebody else? It could just be a conversation. I mean, pre-bunking doesn't need to be a video on a tech platform. It's just a rhetorical technique. What I like to do is find out if you follow the viral analogy, which I like. Some people don't like it because viruses sometimes freak people out. But, because I talk in terms of susceptible host, right? Misinformation can only misinformation can only affect a host that's susceptible. Right. One factor could be identity that makes somebody susceptible. Another could be cognitive bias. It could be lots of things. But what you need to know is somebody's status. Have they already been infected, right? In the sense that they've been radicalized. They're not going to listen to anything you say. Are they just toying around with the idea, but they haven't really internalized it yet? Or is this the first time that somebody is going to hear this? And then you can look at your pre-bunking toolbox and pick the right approach. So, for example, when I talk to somebody concretely, and I do this all the time, I talk to MAGA people, I talk to conspiracy theorists, I talk to neo-Nazis, and because I find it fascinating as a psychologist, and we're kind of trained to be non-judgmental and stay calm and figure out what drives someone. But I know for people it can be hard sometimes. But I figure out what's driving them, how often have they been exposed, like what's going on here. And so when I feel like, okay, this person is pretty deep into it, a fact-based inoculation is going to antagonize them. Okay. So if I'm going to try to go the fact route and say, or a narrow spectrum vaccine, as we call it, which is you try to pre-bunk a specific claim or a specific myth, they're going to counter argue because they've read so much of it already. They're going to have counterclaims. And then you're going to get lost in this battle about, I don't know, with like 9/11 truthers, like, did the tower fall? Did it not fall? What explosive? Is it realistic? And so on. So you want to avoid that in that scenario. You want to go higher. You want to go to technique, the broad spectrum route. You want to avoid all facts and go at the level of, have you heard about this idea of a false dilemma or emotional manipulation or conspiratorial sort of reasoning, right? Have you considered non-conspiratorial alternatives for the same explanation? What about motivations, incentives, right? What are the motivations of people spreading this information? What are their incentives? And can you try to unravel for people how they might be manipulated? So one of the things I found talking to conspiracy theorists is they hate being manipulated. And so they actually engage with you if you go this route of like, we don't want to be manipulated. We want to break down the incentives and the motivations of actors. And that's more at the level of a technique level pre-bunk, right? And that works better for them. So when I talk to somebody who's never heard a thing before about the misinformation, I'm going to go very specific. I'm going to say, this is what some people, listen, forewarned is forearmed, right? You need to know some people, they're going to try to tell you Tylenol, causes autism. The American Academy of Pediatrics has said there's absolutely no evidence for that. It's an unproven link. You should know this and this and this. And then people are empowered to make up their own mind when they see the unproven or false information. I'm just giving an example from, what's been in the news.
Hmm.
It's even more important when the source of the misinformation could be an official source, like,
Yeah.
coming from a government official. And so that's kind of the range at which you can pre-bunk. And sometimes you might realize that you're not the best person to deliver the pre-bunk because they're not going to listen to you, but they might listen to another friend that you have in common. And so you can get that friend to deliver the pre-bunk. So I think a lot goes into the pre-assessment, like, where is this person in terms of their beliefs? Who are they going to listen to? And then you can pick your pre-bunking tools and engage with them. But to make this long story very short in terms of the ending, I think the most powerful thing we can do to scale it is to inoculate each other and to pre-bunk misinformation, because the way to scale it is for everyone to contribute, right? If you know misinformation is coming, you need to pre-bunk your neighbors and your family members so that they're immune when it hits them, and that helps slow its spread. Because with one WhatsApp message, your family group goes to another family's group and others, and before you know it, hundreds of thousands of people have been exposed. So you need to cut it off at the beginning. And so if I know misinformation is coming, I'm gonna tell my partner, I'm gonna tell my family members, and they might not always listen, but based on where they're at, you can try to tailor your pre-bump to maximize uptake.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of power at the local level. And yeah, I really appreciate that distinction between the technique versus fact based. I've also encountered that with my conversations with different people and also people asking me, like, what do I do? And, one big thing I often find is, yeah, people will focus so much on the specific claim that they disagree with that they miss kind of the bigger picture of why that person believes that particular claim that they think is false. Yeah, you can, argue about this facts on this particular thing all day and make no progress. But then if you understand that maybe they have this broader distrust of an institution because of some reason, and that's actually contributing to that claim that they believe, then it can be much more productive. All right. So another layer to this whole space of misinformation, disinformation that I think is important is the economics and the economics incentives and how easy it is to spread disinformation. And there's a paper that I saw you were recently a co-author on that dove into this. And you had this new website, this Cambridge Online Trust and Safety Index that, from my understanding, showed how easy it was to make inauthentic accounts. I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about that. Like, how easy is it to make these fake accounts, and how does that impact our digital ecosystem, especially with AI making that potentially even easier?
Yeah, yeah. So, for the last decade or so, we've been doing this work on individual beliefs and susceptibility, and people from other disciplines. And you might appreciate this being interdisciplinary yourself. They often complain about you're focusing too much on the individual, right? This is a systemic problem. It's incentive, social media, and so on. And so after a while, we started thinking about, okay, well, what are some of the other challenges that are involved here that sort of transcend the individual? And a colleague at the business school was working on exposing kind of hidden markets. And one of the ideas that we came up with was it turns out you can actually scrape the API, which is for people who don't know, is the interface of apps and programs from which you can obtain data, like how people scrape data from X or Facebook, but other technology companies have APIs too. They're just not always open. But it turns out really interestingly that these shady organizations, often based in Russia or China, that sell fake accounts or sell actually phone numbers that you can register in order to create an account on a social media company through SMS verification. They sell those online and they had open APIs. So it turns out you can actually scrape their data about what it costs to get one of these fake numbers and fake accounts. And there's hundreds of them and they're located all over the world. And we decided, well, what if we expose this market? And because it's a gray market. Nobody knows what the demand or the supply is. And if you don't know, if it's not transparent, you can't act on it. Regulators can't act on it. Social media companies can't act on it. So one of the ways we thought in which we could hold social media companies to account is by exposing how cheap or expensive manipulation is on their platforms. And so we put this dashboard together, which is the Cambridge Online Trust and Safety Index. And it's free. Anyone can access and download the data. And you can see in real time, yesterday, I was on it yesterday, account for Instagram in the UK, 8 cents. That's how cheap it is to register potentially a fake account. We're talking 8 cents. So, in the age of AI, where there's a lot of inauthentic online activity, and in fact, we're looking at the majority of online content becoming inauthentic, bots talking to bots, and that is then used to train LLMs. And so, but in terms of influence operations, buying bot armies, for example, during political elections, we did some analyses in a supplement showing that there's some interesting things you can predict based on those market dynamics, right? If you see price fluctuations before an election, for example, or to evaluate the efficacy of regulation. So the UK just passed a ban on SIM farms, which is kind of what we're talking about now. There's these SIM farms that buy in bulk, and that's what a lot of AI and AI-driven bot armies are using. And you can assess how effective that regulation is by looking at, is it increasing the price of online manipulation, right? And social media companies could do something. They could make it more expensive for manipulation to happen on their platforms, for example, by displaying or pairing locations with phone numbers. So it's much easier to manipulate if the phone number you register isn't connected to a geographical location, because then people don't know where it's coming from, right?
Hmm.
But if you have a phone number coming from Russia and you're operating in a US account, that's going to look strange, right? And so actually WhatsApp has done a pretty good job, and they made a statement in response to our index that, they've already done things to reduce manipulation attempts in that way, because they do pair phone numbers with location, and they're doing some other things as well. And so, yeah, it can help social media companies actually do a better job of reducing inauthentic activity, because beyond misinformation, I think that's becoming a huge problem. It's just that a lot of the
Hmm.
content we interact with is not authentic, and it's either fully AI automated sort of driven, or it's a human in the loop where there are some trolls and some bots, and humans are creating it, and then it's being scaled by AI. But mostly it's inauthentic, and I think that's a big problem. And coming back to the question that you posed earlier about how can people sort of get involved, I think a lot of people, especially including academics, are probably overconfident about their abilities. That's also what the research shows: is overconfidence bias. "Oh, I'm not fooled by bots. I know how to, spot inauthentic activity. I know about misinformation." But if you look at the research, most people don't. Most people are overconfident. Some people more than others. So it's about how well you calibrate, of course. People do better than baseline on average, but we're still not very good at it. And part of the reason for that is we developed this other thing called the Misinformation Susceptibility Test, which is a free test anyone can take. It's called the MIST. You can find it online, and it tells you how discerning you are, how gullible, how distrusting. But it's also a motivational tool. It can show people, actually, maybe you didn't do as well as you thought, and you could benefit from a little more training. And it could be a good stepping stone to an intervention, for example, or to engage people with an online manipulation index, and how that might be used. So yeah, we're always trying to find new ways to expose manipulation and to motivate people to sort of engage with this problem. Because many people might not know how inexpensive it is actually to buy fake accounts, and a lot of what we see online is actually inauthentic, fabricated social realities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't think a lot of people understand the scale of it. I mean, I found your paper really shocking to see just how cheap it was to make these fake accounts in different countries. And I think being aware that how much inauthentic activity is in our feeds, and then also understanding that, there's this broader incentive to sharing conflict and keeping us outraged for a variety of reasons, I think could be really helpful in the pre-bunking space. But I was curious, kind of as we wrap up here, really big picture. You talked a little bit about how these platforms can do a better job combating inauthentic accounts. As far as one kind of big picture solution, I was curious if you could speak about any preferences you have for if you could pick one thing to prioritize our energies on. One thing that really jumps out to you, is it, platform responsibility, scaling education? Are there any specific policies that make sense to you? Is there any kind of like large scale intervention that you think could help clean up our noisy information ecosystem?
Yeah, and maybe I'm going to be a proper academic and kind of cheat here and pick two things.
That's fine.
Because I think whatever I pick, people are going to say, if I pick education, people are going to say, oh, he's focusing too much on individuals. And if I pick social media, they're going to say he's always blaming social media. I do think that there's two things that are my top priorities at the moment. I think one is, what I've learned is that although technology companies and governments can be great agents in scaling the tools that we have, they're not reliable agents in terms of having long-term interests of the people in mind. Sometimes, but not always. So one of the things we need to do is to integrate not only pre-bunking, but media, I like to think of it as a multi-layered defense system. Obviously, prevention is better than cure. That's what psychology mostly has to say about misinformation. But also, debunking also works. Media literacy also works if it's done well and in an evidence-based way, right? And accuracy nudging and all of the things. And so I think we need a multi-layered defense system that maybe starts with pre-bunking and then goes into real-time fact-checking and then effective debunking. And I think we need to implement that in schools, in every school, in every year, in every state across the whole country. And not some piecemeal implementation as part of a civics course that you get some media literacy lessons. It really needs to be its own thing. I mean, it's just baffling. If you look at interviews with teachers, what they've done in the UK, for example, teachers are anxious. They don't know how to counter conspiracy theories. They don't know how to talk to students about misogyny and online influencers. They don't know how to deliver this material. So you need to train the trainers, which is an investment, and then we need to have a standardized curriculum. Probably give schools the flexibility to implement it themselves in the way that is sufficient for them, but there needs to be some kind of mandate. If you look at Finland, for example, everyone always talks about Finland, and they're not perfect, and they don't do enough, I think, evaluation of what they're doing. But one of the things I think they're getting right is that they start at 4 years old. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and we have conversations about what's plausible, what's not plausible. She has a kids channel on YouTube, and sometimes it jumps from Bluey or Peppa Pig to some questionable show based on the algorithm, right? And so you can't leave kids alone with that technology. And Australia just passed a ban of social media, no social media under 16. I mean, I think that's pretty crude. I'm all for restricting social media during school time, but at the end of the day, I think we want to have responsible citizens. I think the better way is to teach responsible use of technology and AI. Some schools are doing that in terms of, maybe give them a tablet and they can only look at family photos when they're 4 years old, right?
Mhm.
And then when they're 5 years old, they can read a book, and then you slowly increase it, and then eventually they can use social media. But people are not allowed to drive before they have a driver's license, and so I feel like we need to apply the same logic to technology and social media, including how to spot misinformation. Finland shares a border with Russia, so they're well attuned to the power of propaganda, and that's why they start at 4 years old. And that can be non-political. You don't have to talk about specific facts. You can talk about general propaganda techniques. That's what I often talk about with people. That in the 1800s, there's paintings of cow udders sprouting out of people's mouths and ears, because they said if you took the cowpox vaccine against
Mm.
smallpox, you would turn into a human-cow hybrid, right? Same with mRNA technology. It's going to change your body. It's the same technique, 200 years old. We need to know about the history of propaganda so people can make up their own mind about whether they want to get vaccinated or not, but free from potential manipulation. And it takes time to design those courses, right? And there's going to be PTA resistance, and there's going to be, not much appetite in the current government. We're doing better in the UK in terms of getting a minister appointed potentially to look at media literacy overhaul across the country. Schools are worried, are interested, and we have an independent regulator here that's interested in doing things. So there's more potential for this perhaps in the UK and Europe at the moment, but let's look at the next government in the United States, if there is going to be a next government, which I say, with some hesitancy. But there needs to be a total overhaul of the education system and in every year of education, so that by the time they graduate, they're going to have good levels of immunity to misinformation. We're going to have robust, because democracy relies on an informed citizenry, right? In Finland, they're scoring a 90th percentile in math and literacy, media literacy, freedom of the press, structural things, right? Also, but that's what I think we need to do. And then the second thing I'll be short on is that we need to change the incentives of social media. I think, sure, algorithms are problematic. Lots of things problematic about social media, but I think the most important thing for me is that the incentives are not good. Social media incentivizes the worst in people. Algorithms prioritize extremism and outrage over accuracy. I've had many talks with Instagram and other Meta products. They would come back and say, we're a company. If we just prioritize educational content, we're going to go bankrupt. And so there needs to be what do we optimize for? I think they could make simple tweaks, like they could optimize for, and people have floated this idea for public service content, right? More Sesame Street in people's feeds, less Nazi memes. And I think, it's a joke, but actually I have developmental college who've studied Sesame Street and actually show that it makes kids more pro-social over the course of their development if you watch Sesame Street as a kid. Maybe not everyone's on board with public programming, but, you could rephrase it and say, fact check content, accurate content, whatever term you want to use, but something that's in the public interest that
Mhm.
needs to be prioritized in social media algorithms. We need to change the incentives, change the business model. And I think there's a lot of appetite for that in Europe and coming from the regulators, perhaps less so in the United States. Um, we need to change the way those platforms incentivize users, and that will, I think, change the types of content that's shared. And we have some experimental data on this that when when we ask people about headlines from social media, they're not so accurate. But then when we start paying people, all of a sudden, they start giving accurate answers because a lot of time people know what the answer is, but they have other motivations congruent with their identities, right? For sharing this information. And so we need that's a simple way to illustrate that if you change the incentive, you can change people's behavior. So it's not we need to ban social media companies forever. We just need to redesign them to work with rather than against human psychology. So yes, standardized education on this topic that is mandatory in every school in every state, and we need to change the incentives on social media.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, and I appreciate that. I know it's tough as academics sometimes we're trying not to think too
Yeah.
much about specific concrete outcomes and, picking one thing that could help, but, I think those are 2 things that I've been reading a lot more about too that I think could be practical and implement, and we could see, like, real world positive effects. So, yeah, I mean, and, I think that's encouraging and provides me with some hope, but I was curious, like, if you feel like there's some cautious optimism you can find, like, it seem like you're seeing people do this. Do you think is there room for cautious optimism as we navigate these uncertain times?
A lot of people I talk to are depressed about this and other topics, and they just look at the news and just think, I was just, the start of some of my presentations are a graph from the Economist Intelligence Index that shows the quality of democracies, and it's just a straight line down around the world. And my students always joke that I'm always optimistic, and I think it's because I work on interventions and I see the individual level effects, which make me hopeful. And I think your question has the right phrasing, cautiously optimistic. I mean, we've worked for so many years with social media companies, build relationships, convince them of the evidence, implement it in their products, and then they scale it across hundreds of millions of people. And it felt we've made huge progress, right? We did all this work. And then from one day to the next, it's all gone. And that's depressing, and that's demoralizing and demotivating. But then, we find new solutions. We go back into schools, right? And we design educational curricula. There's other technology companies that are now interested while social media companies aren't. Regulators who, we go to the EU and say pre-bunking, maybe it needs to be in the Digital Services Act, and they've incorporated into the Digital Services Act. So now regulators can hold social media companies accountable and say, you need to be doing something like this. We're not going to leave it to you to decide, right? Here's a list of things you could do. We're not going to force you to do one particular thing. And so, there's always, I think, ways to try to move forward. Let me give you 2 short anecdotes. Imran Ahmed is the CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a well-known nonprofit in the UK, perhaps now also in the US, because they were sued by Musk. I don't know if you remember this, but they document hate speech and misinformation online, and they had a big report about X saying that there's a lot of misinformation, and they had scraped data from X after Elon instituted his ban or his payment scheme for that you can't scrape the API anymore. You have to pay ridiculous amounts of money now, and went to court in California. And this is a small NGO, right? This is a guy who's talking. He literally had a tweet about even if you disagree, free speech, should never be attacked, should never be silenced. He tweeted something like this. And then he goes and tries to silence an NGO for exposing misinformation on X because he said it was hurting their advertiser model. Advertisers became concerned about that. So obviously, incredibly inconsistent. But what came out of that was that the judge tossed the case and said, obviously, Musk, you're trying to silence an NGO over concerns about speech. There's just no case here. I mean, whether or not they scrape that data gray area, your overriding concern seems to be that their speech is impacting advertisers, but their speech isn't violating any laws. And so that, that case got tossed out. And Imran, said to me, we're winning. We're winning against the most powerful, the richest guy on the planet. It's like, I'm optimistic because, we're still winning and we're still publishing our reports and we're still holding them accountable. And then on the other hand, I was talking to, there was this event at Cambridge, closed door sort of event, 12 members of U.S. Congress who I was asked for some reason to join them and talk about misinformation. I mean, I was a bit nervous about this, including some MAGA people. And one congressman from Nebraska, I think, he came up to me and he said, I understand misinformation. That they've been making claims that have all this money, and my wife keeps asking where it is, and because I don't have it, but people keep saying I have all this money, um, and these conspiracy theories about me, and it's like I get it, but I didn't like the censorship stuff under Biden. And, he was this sort of Southern, well, no, I guess not really Southern, but, he had he had that sort of, intonation. He said usually, he'd prefer to discuss with a little whiskey.
Mhm.
But we sat at the bar, and then engaged him on this conversation. And, we just had a normal conversation. And I said, look, I'm also not a fan of censorship. I think the whole COVID thing was a little exaggerated. They took down some stuff for 30 days because, it was emerging science. They thought it was a conspiracy theory with the bioweapon stuff, right? And then later it said, oh, it's a possibility. And most of the stuff that took down was probably crazy conspiracy stuff anyway. And yeah, maybe they took down some legitimate content that they shouldn't have, and then you apologize and you move on and you try to do better, right? But it wasn't some crazy censorship regime. We're talking about 30 days and a few hundred posts. I mean, it's really a big nothing burger. But I agree with you that censorship is not ideal. And at the end of the day, we agreed misinformation is real. It's a problem. We should be doing something about it as long as it isn't censorship. And I feel that was a normal conversation where people who might have opposite political views can compromise on the fact that there's a real problem that we need to be doing something on, and we can exclude certain solutions that both sides think are probably too crude. And that was not a conversation that I expected, and so that made me optimistic. Then I learned that this particular congressman is not going up for re-election because they feel that White House has become too toxic to have, even for this conservative, traditionally conservative Republican Congress member, that, it's become too toxic of a place to have reasonable conversations. And yeah, that depresses me a little bit. But the idea that there's lots of reasonable people from across the political spectrum out there who want to do something about misinformation. All the Republicans came out with the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing where they were like, this is too far. The thing is not censoring people. So you can't go and turn around and intimidate, Disney company with threats. And, this is mafia state business. That there's lots of people who are aligned. And one of the missions I'm on now is to bring people from across the political spectrum together who all agree on these problems. I sit on a board in the UK on the Council for Countering Disinformation with a member of former minister who is part of small state conservative sort of agenda. And he absolutely believes that misinformation is a problem. He supports the Online Safety Act and thinks that we should be cracking down on some of these things. And I think that's the kind of environment that we need to get back to. And it makes me cautiously optimistic that there's enough people out there from across the political aisle who are interested in doing something about misinformation, and that we can get those people together to exert some influence and come to an agreement. So yeah, beyond the work that we're doing and showing that it's can be efficacious and that it can be scaled, we obviously still need cooperation in order to get it implemented. And so that's where I spend a lot of my time now having those conversations. So yeah, I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic. Um, but yeah, there are real threats out there to democracy that we shouldn't downplay. But at the end of the day, I think there's there's evidence and there's goodwill, and we just need to put the two together.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's all too easy to find the doom and gloom in today's age, but I think it could be helpful to latch on to some of the positive ideas and work and collaboration that's happening as well. So if people are interested in finding you online, your work, where can they find you? What social media or websites would be helpful for them to search?
Yeah, good question. If people want any of the resources, they're available for free on inoculation.science. I'm on Blue Sky and LinkedIn mostly these days, so that's where people can find me. There's foolproofbook.com if people want to know more about the book, Foolproof, where a lot of this stuff is. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Great.
I
Yeah,
feel
I'll
like
definitely. Yeah.
this is the end of what's that show? It's not Hot Wings, but this guy who has people
Uh,
eat spicy.
yeah.
Yeah, and at the end he's like, tell people what you got going on in your lives. But
Well, you
I'm
didn't have
always
to
like,
have
oh
any.
yeah,
You
yeah.
didn't have.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Maybe you should add something like that. Make
Yeah.
it, people talk about misinformation, make the whole experience rather spicy.
Yeah, that'd be actually that's something I've been thinking about. Is to talk about collaborations and stuff, like having people who disagree, eat hot wings together or do some kind of fun event. Maybe there's some potential there.
In our disagreements with David Rand and Gordon Pennycook, which you may know about, was another research team that we've had some serious disagreements about. Dave Rand at one point suggested, because I think like 75% of us are all into music and doing stuff with instruments. And so it's like, maybe we should like get the band together, do some songs, do something completely unrelated to misinformation. So we gives us an opportunity to all get along before we do our next adversarial collaboration or something like that. So yeah, he joked about doing something fun together that isn't related to misinformation, which actually I think it can be a good idea. Because the people that I disagree with, when I meet them interpersonally, we always have a good time, and so it becomes harder for people to get worked up if you realize that, oh yeah, actually I get along with this person most of the time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, Sander, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on.